feature that I've really come to love over the last few years is the show me my password input. So instead of typing into a password input and just getting these black dots that don't really mean anything to us, we can actually toggle on and off whether or not we can see our password in the input. So when we type, we see something, more like this in the input. So what I want to do in this tutorial is show you how to implement that functionality, because it's not that difficult. It's a lot simpler than you'd think. And it's one of those features that provides a ton of value for your customers. It makes it a lot easier for them to get in your product, and it removes a ton of potential frustration, especially for any customers that have complex passwords that they type in from memory, so they don't use a password manager or anything like that. And what we're going to do to demonstrate this is use PUP. And PUP is the ultimate boilerplate for products built by us at Clever Beagle. So we work with mentorship customers to build their own products, and we use PUP as the foundation for that. So even though it's used with customers, this is completely free, open source, and it's, as you can see here, MIT licensed. So you can download this, clone it, and tweak it to your heart's content. We don't care. We're happy to have you using it. And this comes stock with accounts and routing and server-side running and all these cool features that you're going to want as the foundation for your product, but you don't have to build them. We've already done it for you. So we'd really appreciate it if you could go over to GitHub, make sure to go over and click star, and that way you'll get all of our notifications and updates on what we're up to, and hopefully we can get you to build a product with us. So with all that said, what we're going to do is dig into building this feature. So I'm going to jump over to my text editor, and I've already cloned a copy of PUP and have this up and running. And what I'm looking at here is the login page in PUP. So PUP is organized into a bunch of different folders, but in this case we're underneath imports, UI, pages, the login folder under that, and then login.js. And login.js is what we see in the browser right now. So this is what's rendered on screen. And what we're going to do is scroll down real quick. And if we look, we can see the password input here. And so what I've got highlighted here is two pieces. So this is the label that sits on top of the password input. And this is the actual password input itself. And so what we're going to do is right beneath this, we're going to add in a nice little checkbox that users can click to trigger on and off or reveal their password on and off to themselves. And so to start with that, we can see here we've got this control label component, and that's coming from the React Bootstrap package. So this is installed in PUP by default. You don't have to download this. Just make sure, when you clone PUP for the first time, to run an npm install or Meteor npm install in this case, because PUP is based on a platform called Meteor, and we need to make sure we do that. So Meteor npm install. But once you do that, you'll have access to React Bootstrap. It's already built in. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to take this control label component that I've imported here, and we're going to use that to build out the checkbox functionality that we want to trigger that reveal of the password. So right beneath the password input looks like a good spot, and we're going to say control label. And then inside of that control label, I'm going to add a checkbox element. So I'm going to say just a regular checkbox, and I'm going to give it an attribute of checked. And I'm going to set it to a value. I'm thinking a little bit ahead here, so we haven't quite done this yet, but I'm going to set it to this.state.showPassword. And so in this case, show password doesn't exist yet. We haven't defined it, but that's kind of a hint for where we're headed here. We're going to use state inside of React to trigger on and off whether or not our password is visible. And so to give us that value, what we're going to do is jump up to the top of our component, and we can see here we have this function called Constructor. And the Constructor is the very, very first function that gets called by React when it's putting a component onto the screen. So this is literally in memory in JavaScript. So this is before you or I as a user see anything drawn on the actual screen or rendered on the screen. This function is being called. And much like the name suggests, it's setting up or constructing our component to be ready to go to be put on screen. And as part of that construction process, something we can do is define a default set of state values. So in React, state is this kind of temporary, I guess you'd call it, tracking of what the UI should look like, or what the current it's kind of hard to explain state without using the word state, but state is essentially what is the current state of this component? What does it look like, or what are the values on that component? And in our case, we know that we're going to use show password. So show password is one of the values, and we're trying to determine, well, what is the state of show password? And so in the constructor, what we can do is set a default value. So literally, when this component first loads up, we can say what a state value should or should not be. So here what I'm saying is show password is going to be false. So by default, all we want to do is show a regular password input like our users are used to. We don't want to reveal their password to them or anything that might make them nervous. We just want to have a regular old-fashioned password input. But what we're going to do to make all this work is down here, we're going to say, let's change show password. So by default, again, we're setting it to false. And here we've got checked equals this dot state show password. So when this first loads up, checked is going to be false. So our checkbox is going to be false, and our password input's going to be left as is. And so what we got to move towards here is getting the checkbox not only to check, but we also need to make it control, our password input and what that thing looks like on screen. So what I'm going to do now is add an Unchanged Handler to our checkbox. And what this is going to do is take a function, and it's going to call to this.setState. So in React, when we want to make a modification to the state value that we have up here in our constructor that we've set by default, we don't want to modify it directly or mutate it directly. You'll hear that word a lot in React. You'll hear the word mutate. Don't mutate state directly. And the reason we don't want to do that is that can break what React sees and how it goes about rendering things on screen. So to help us avoid that, React ships with a this.setState value. So setState is built into React. That's not something we have to define or get from a package or anything like that. It's built into React. So when we call this.setState and pass an object, what we can do is specify which values on state we want to change. So what I'm going to do to start here is I'm going to say this.setState show password true. So what we expect to get from this is when we click our checkbox, it should actually check. And you know what I'm going to do real quick here is back this up a little bit. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to save this. And we're going to jump over to the browser so we can see our checkbox actually show up, but then get a feel for what we're trying to accomplish here. So I've got my checkbox on screen, but you'll notice when I click it, it doesn't do anything. And that's because we're not really telling the checkbox that it's checked. And the reason we're not is because we added this attribute checked equals this state show password. So our checkbox right now is dependent on that value to know whether or not it's checked. So this is known as a controlled component in React. So when you explicitly set a value or an attribute on an input and you pass it a state value, that means that you're trying to control that component. So you need to tell that component or that element everything that it needs to know about the world. So in this case, we have to tell the checkbox whether or not it's checked. And so I'm going to bring back in that Unchanged Handler that we were typing, and inside of there I've got this.setState show password true. So let's see what that accomplishes. Jump back over to the browser, wait a few seconds here for a refresh, and then now if I check this box, it checks. But if I keep checking it, so it's not actually updating. And that makes sense if we look at our code. So if we come back here and say, well, wait a minute, we're saying checked is this.state show password, and that's correct. But if we look very closely at our Unchanged Handler, what we're doing here is we're saying this.setState show password to true. And we're doing that every time the Unchanged Handler fires, which means that no matter what we do, once we've clicked this, show password is going to be true. And remember, show password or this.state.show password on state is false by default. So when the page loads, it's unchecked, but as soon as we check it, that's it. It's always going to be checked. So what we got to do is a little trickery here. We're going to put some funky looking code in here. We're going to say exclamation point this state show password. Now, This is probably one of the coolest things that you'll learn in JavaScript. This is not a React specific thing, this is a JavaScript thing, but it's very helpful when you're trying to build dynamic UIs with a tool like React. So what this is saying is give us the inverse of this.state.showPassword. So if we think about that, when we first load up our component, and again we'll jump back up here real quick so this makes sense. When we load up our component, we're setting this.state.showPassword to false. And so what we're trying to do is get a toggle sort of functionality going here. We want to say, okay, if it's this, flip it to that. If it's that, flip it to this. And back and forth ad infinitum until, somebody's mouse breaks or something silly like that. So if we look at this, we're saying, give us the inverse of the current value of this.state.showPassword. So what that means is if it's false by default, when we click this button, or we click this checkbox, it's gonna flip to true. And if it's true, it's gonna flip to false. And for each click, we're just gonna flip back and forth. And the reason that that works is because in React, whenever we change state, we trigger a re-render or another call to this render function. And so what's gonna happen is this is all gonna re-render, and the current value of this.state.showPassword is going to be set on the input here, but also what's going to be passed to our setState call. So if it's currently true, we're going to have true. If it's currently false, we're going to have false. So what's going to happen now is as we click this checkbox, we're going to invert this value, this state.showPassword, back and forth between true and false. So if we save this and jump back to our browser, instead of getting the checked once and it's always checked, now we get a nice toggle ability. So we're on our way. So we still don't have a toggle for our password. So this box is checked, but our password isn't revealed to us. So we're not quite done. So we're going to keep moving here. And the next thing I'm going to do is just beneath our checkbox. And technically this is going to render alongside of our checkbox, but you'll see. So we're going to say show password. So we're going to give this a label so we actually know what is this checkbox, because a standalone checkbox doesn't really make a ton of sense. So we're going to say show password, and we're going to jump back to the browser because I am most definitely one of those developers who has to constantly reload to see what everything looks like. So now, notice, pretty cool. We see show password with our checkbox, but again, we're still not seeing this. And you'll notice when I click the word show password, even though our Unchanged Handler is on our checkbox, the control label component that we have back in our code here is smart enough to know that, okay, you're changing this input relative to this text. So it sees these as siblings, and it knows that, okay, when I click on that, I also want to fire a click on the checkbox input. So that's a really cool little UX trick there. So it makes it a little more tactile for our users. They're not having to zero in on this tiny little checkbox. They can click anywhere on here and get the same effect. So, all right, we're on our way. We're very close to getting this working. So our next step is going to be to modify our actual password input. So what I have highlighted here is this input. It's the actual input where users are going to type in their password. And we need to modify the type attribute on this input. So what I'm going to do is change the type to a React expression. And inside of that expression, I'm going to say this.state show password, and then I'm going to say question mark. And so what we're starting here is known as a ternary operator. And that's best thought of as a condensed if-else statement. So it's just an inline if-else statement. So instead of us having to say, if this and blah, 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 we can just do it all in one line and JavaScript will interpret it just fine. So again, this is the ternary operator. So the way that this works is we can say, if this value returns true, question mark, do this. And this in this case is going to be saying or passing the string text. And then we're going to have another clause and say password. So the way that this reads is, if this state show password is true, do this. Otherwise, or else, do this. And so this is where we can start to see this coming together. So we're saying if this state show password is true, we want to render this input as a vanilla or regular text input. So not a password input, which means we should be able to see what the user is typing into the input. However, if show password is false, we want to fall back to the else statement or turn this back into a password input. So this is the magic. So let's see if we save this and go back to the browser, we should have a working feature here. So we're going to say password. Okay, so by default it's not revealed. That's good. Hot dog. Look at that. We got a show password feature. Isn't that neat? So what's happening here is as we click, we're changing or inverting the current value of state, and that state value is triggering a re-render of our component, which means that this re-renders and is effectively re-evaluated. So this state show password, whether it's true or false, is re-evaluated, and that input is drawn on screen. Now that's what's happening in the code, but because React is so fast, our user has no concept of that change actually taking place. So even though we're changing the type of the input here, all they know is that, hey, I can see my password now, check that out. So we could stop here, but I'm a bit of an obsessive, and so I don't really like the style of this. So to make sure that this is something that you can walk away from this tutorial and actually implement in your product, we're going to clean up these styles a little bit. And one of the tools that we use inside of Pup to do our styles is a library called Styled Components. And what I'm going to do is import a method called styled from that library. So styled components are a really neat tool for allowing us to define, literally like the name implies, styled React components. And the way that they work is, it's a little funky the first time you see it. You look at it and you're like, wait, what is going on there? But they're really useful for defining styles right alongside of your components. So if you've ever written CSS before, you'll know that it's kind of a chore to manage past a certain point. So if you're dealing with like a really tiny project, it's not so bad. But once you're building like a product level application or a product level website, you're going to have a ton of CSS and it can just become an absolute nightmare to manage. So styled components is a great solution to get around a lot of those management headaches that you typically run into with style sheets. So let's take a look at how this works. So what I'm going to say here is const, and I'm going to say show password. And you'll notice that I'm using all capitals here. I guess what do they call this? Pascal case. So I'm using Pascal case and I'm saying const show password is equal to, and then I'm going to call that styled function from up here. I'm going to invoke it as a function, and to it I'm going to pass the control label component. So effectively what we're saying here is, hey, styled components, go ahead and style up a control label component for us. And when we say style up, basically what's going to happen is we're going to pass it the control label, and whatever we pass here, and you'll notice this is the funky part. So we've got two backticks here following our call. So this is a string literal, and as far as JavaScript is concerned, it sees this as a string being returned and called as a function at the exact same time. So effectively, this gets read as though we're doing something like this. Really weird, but works, and it's a nice way to clean up the syntax in your code. So if we back this up, again, we just have our call to styled, and then we pass it, so we call styled as a function, and we pass it the component that we're trying to add styles to. In this case, because control label already has some styles from Bootstrap, we're going to be adding additional styles to that component. So again, keep an eye on this. We're gonna use that in a second, but for now, just understand that we're saying styled, and then we pass control label. And in this string, or this string literal, what we're going to do is define our styles. So I've already kind of thought this through before I started recording here. So what I'm going to do is just add those styles in. So I know that we want to give a little bit of a margin between our show password component and the bottom of the password input. So if we jump back over here, we can see these two are button up against each other. That shouldn't be there. So we're going to create a 10 pixel gap in between those two. And then the other thing I want to do is change the style of our checkbox. So the checkbox, again, if we jump back, is pretty smashed up against our text. It doesn't look like a quality product. You know, we're not really caring about what we're doing. So we're going to care and clean this up. So what I'm going to do is say for this checkbox, we're going to say display it as inline block. And what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that we can add margins to this element, so to the checkbox, but it's not going to display it full width. So usually with CSS, a block level element takes up the full width of its parent container. In this case, it's still displayed inline, so I mean it's displaying inline next to whatever its sibling is, but it can take on block style attributes or properties. So we're going to say display inline block, and I'm going to give this a margin right of 5 pixels. So that's going to create a 5 pixel gap in between our checkbox and our text here. And then if you look real close, and this is I'm not kidding when I say I'm obsessive, so you'll notice that our checkbox and our text are off by about a pixel in terms of their vertical top points, or their vertical, I guess you would say their baseline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add position relative here, and I'm going to say top -1 pixel. And I say -1 pixel because it looks like our checkbox is the one that's going down about a pixel. So we're going to say -1 pixel. We're going to yank it back up. And so position relative, what that allows us to do is specify position attributes. So this is like top, right, bottom, left. We can specify those on an element once we at least set relative. And we're not going to go down that rabbit hole about the other types of positions now. So just know that setting position relative is allowing us to specify this top value. So now that we've got that, the missing piece here is that we set this variable show password equal to whatever this call to styled is returning. And in this case, this is the cool part, is styled components, or the styled function, is going to return us a React component. So show password, for all intents and purposes now, is a React component that we can render on screen. And if we think about it, well, we wrapped, or we styled, a control label component. So because this is a React component, we can just replace control label here with show password. And so now this is returning a React component, but it's going to include the styles that we defined up top here inside of our string literal. So if I go ahead and save this, we go back to the browser. Again, after a few seconds here, we should have a much better looking show password toggle. So if we come up here and we say password, there we go. So that's it, folks. That is a show password feature for your application. So now you can add this to your login screen. Again, as we saw, not much code. We've got a little bit of styles, and that's if you care, you know, if you're not too fussy about that type of thing, you can even omit the styles, and all you got to do is add some state values. And what else do we have down here? We've got a checkbox and some text. So that's about it, and that's a great way to learn how to use React State and also utilize state. You know, it's one of those things that can kind of confuse folks when you're first starting out with React and you're starting to build UIs with it, but it's a super powerful tool to use, especially for features like this. So I hope you enjoyed that, and thanks for watching. And before you go, make sure to tap the subscribe button on our page, and also if you're looking for notifications, please hit the bell, because that does help us out. We want to know that you're actually interested in these, and we're not just talking into the ether and teaching no one. So thanks again for watching, and have fun building that input. If you enjoyed this tutorial, I'd really appreciate it if you head over to cleverbeagle.com/subscribe and sign up to get our latest tutorials and advice in your inbox as soon as they're published.